What makes a novel unputdownable? What makes readers love a story so much that they can't stop reading it and it sticks with them for years, changing the way they think and the way they view the world? You might be surprised to learn that it's not just one element of storytelling that creates a novel with this kind of power. Instead, it's several elements working together that gives your story its unique forward momentum, its heartbeat, its narrative drive. Today, we're going to dive into how you can create that kind of power by understanding and using the 4 pillars of narrative drive. This is something I call the goal, motivation, stakes, and conflict chain. Hello, and welcome to the Speculative Fiction Writing Made Simple podcast. I'm your host, Heather Davis. I'm a book coach, developmental editor, and fellow storyteller. And this is the show that's all about how to brainstorm, write, edit, publish, and sell a powerful speculative fiction novel. And maybe just change the world, too. A while back, I got an email from a writer saying that she was really struggling with the concept of goal, motivation, stakes, and conflict. Well, what she actually said was that she was in a deep pit of despair over the whole situation. So I promised her that I would record a podcast episode about this topic to help her sort things out. And, of course, to help all the other writers who are also confused by these terms, or at least confused about how to implement them in their own novel. Real quick, before I jump into the 4 pillars of narrative drive, I want to note that in order for these elements to be effective, you absolutely must have 2 other elements of story structure firmly in place first. Number 1, the point or message of the novel you're writing. Number 2, the character arc of your protagonist. But don't panic. If you're a little shaky on either of these elements, I've got you covered. I'm offering a completely free 3-hour hands-on workshop aimed at helping you complete that necessary foundational work. In this workshop, you'll uncover the point of your novel, explore your protagonist's personality and critical backstory, and create a dynamic character arc for your protagonist that will dovetail with your plot. There will even be live coaching available from yours truly. So please sign up for this free live workshop happening on June 29th from 10 a.m. to 1 p.m. You'll find that link below in the show notes. Make sure to go there right now and sign up so your seat is safe. Okay, back to the 4 pillars of narrative drive. When it comes to these pillars, I like to think of them as questions I ask about the protagonist. So first we'll go through the questions themselves, and then we'll use those questions to get clear on goal, motivation, stakes, and conflict in a popular novel, just to make sure you understand exactly how this process works. Question number 1. What is your protagonist's goal? Your protagonist must have a goal. A protagonist without a goal is a boring character that absolutely no reader wants to follow around for very long. Why? Well, imagine picking up a brand new board game that looks super interesting, but when you read the instructions, you realize there are no rules, and there's no way to win the game. You're just told to move your piece around the board randomly, doing whatever you like until you get tired of playing. That sounds pretty confusing and frustrating, right? I mean, how do you know if you're doing well? How do you know if you're failing completely? And guess what? That's exactly how readers would feel if you introduced a protagonist without a goal. Because it's your protagonist's goal that the reader uses to know whether they are succeeding or failing, whether they are winning or losing the game of your plot. So, your very first order of business in any novel is to figure out what your protagonist's goal is. Maybe you're suddenly wondering, what is an appropriate goal for my protagonist to have? The good news is there aren't a lot of rules around what makes a good goal, but there are 3 important guidelines that I need to share with you. First, the goal must be established early because if the reader ever loses track of your protagonist's goal, they won't be able to make sense of the plot or why any of the events matter. which of course will cause them to become frustrated with the novel, and we definitely don't want that. Second, the goal must be something external, something specific, and something tangible, meaning your protagonist can't just want something nebulous like to be admired by their friends. Instead, let them want the tangible external thing that they think will make their friends admire them. For instance, to win a prestigious sword fighting tournament. What you choose as their external goal doesn't matter much. Again, it just needs to be clear and specific, guiding your protagonist through the plot like a beacon, and acting as the yardstick for the reader so they know if your protagonist is succeeding or failing. Third, the goal must have an internal component that is universal enough to inspire empathy in the reader. Here's something you may or may not know about goals. External goals are necessary, yes, but internal goals are the real driving force of the novel. Internal goals are the reason why the external goals matter to the protagonist. Using our example above, the protagonist can't simply want to win a prestigious sword fighting tournament because that's purely external. Instead, they need to want that external goal for some very specific internal reason. Using the example above, perhaps the protagonist wants to win the prestigious sword fighting tournament, external, so they can win the approval and attention of their father, internal. Notice how that is personal and specific and has both an external and an internal component. That's super important because it's the internal component that makes the goal feel authentic and compelling to readers. After all, the odds are pretty darn good that your reader won't have any personal experience with wanting goals that are similar to the ones your protagonist is pursuing, such as winning a sword fighting tournament. So it might be hard for them to relate to that. However, you have a secret weapon in your arsenal. You have the internal goal that is universal. Because even though your reader might not know what it's like to want to win a sword fighting tournament, they probably can empathize with the need to feel seen and loved by their parents. Okay, before we finish up talking about goals, there's one more thing to discuss. The idea that goals can change. Meaning, the goal your protagonist has in the opening scene of your novel might not be the same goal that they have after the inciting incident. And their goal might change again after the midpoint, and again during the climax. That's okay. That's normal and natural. However, it is also possible that their overarching goal remains the same throughout the novel, and the only thing that really changes is how they're going about getting it via their mini goals. Okay, on to question number 2. What motivates your protagonist to want their goal, and how badly do they want it? Motivation is really important when it comes to making sure your novel has narrative drive, because it explains why your protagonist thinks and acts the way they do. But where does their motivation come from? Well, it comes from their unique backstory, of course, which is why so many villains become fan favorites, right? After all, these characters often have tragic backstories that explain their motivations so darn well that we're willing to forgive them for their most heinous transgressions because we feel empathy for them. So, as you're crafting your protagonist's backstory, which you will later carefully sprinkle into your novel in bite-sized nuggets, you should make sure of 2 important things. First, you should make sure that the backstory you've created for your protagonist explains both the external and the internal facets of their goal. Second, you should make sure it's obvious that your protagonist wants their goal very badly and they're willing to do a whole heck of a lot to get it. Question number 3. What's at stake if your protagonist doesn't achieve their goal? Stakes. Writers worry a lot about stakes, probably because we're warned all the time that every novel must be high stakes in order to keep the reader interested. Well, I'm here to set the record straight and explain the difference between high and low stakes. But first, let's start by agreeing on the definition of what stakes are. Stakes are loosely defined as what will happen if your protagonist doesn't achieve their goal. Yep, that's right. We are talking about consequences here. And there need to be some, or there's absolutely no reason why your protagonist would even bother pursuing their goal at all. But what about the high versus low stakes thing? Well, having high stakes means that something objectively big is at stake. For instance, maybe your protagonist or a member of their family will die if they don't achieve their goal. Or maybe they'll be forced into an awful marriage. On the other hand, having low stakes means that whatever is at stake feels relatively unimportant compared to the life or death stuff we talked about above. For instance, maybe your protagonist just wants to open a coffee shop because they're ready to retire from a life of adventuring, or maybe they just want to pass their magical midterms because they don't want their parents to be disappointed. But here's the thing that most writers don't realize. Low stakes novels can feel every bit as compelling as high stakes novels if you clearly establish the deep emotional truth of why your protagonist wants their goal and how badly they want it. So, as you're deciding what the stakes are in your novel, just remember whatever kind of stakes you choose, whether they be high or low, you just have to make sure that the reader knows how emotionally important it is to your protagonist. And if you do that, even low stakes will feel pretty darn high and pretty darn compelling. Question number 4. Why must your protagonist achieve their goal right now? Do you remember finals in college? Would you have ever really studied that material again if it weren't for the upcoming exam? Of course you wouldn't have. That's because studying for an exam or pursuing any difficult goal probably doesn't happen unless there is an urgent reason to do it. Why? Because it's no fun and it requires a lot of effort. And that's exactly how your protagonist feels about their story goal. Which means, in most cases, there must be an urgent reason why your protagonist is pursuing their goal right now, not next week or in 10 years. Enter the concept of a ticking clock. A ticking clock is a point after which the consequences of not achieving the goal will occur. For example, if your protagonist doesn't learn to disarm an opponent by the time of the sword fighting tournament that happens in exactly 3 months, they will lose the tournament and with it any chance of gaining their father's love and approval. By setting a ticking clock in your novel, the stakes feel more real and scary, and the protagonist and the reader constantly feel them looming. So when you're thinking about what the ticking clock will be in your novel, you just have to ask yourself, what sort of a natural deadline is there in your plot? Is it a birthday party? Is it the end of the semester? Is it a surgery? Is it the beginning of a war? Whatever it is, it should push your protagonist into pursuing their goal now, not next week, not in 10 years. One final note about ticking clocks. They may be present in the story from the very beginning, or they may appear after the midpoint to make the plot and your protagonist's goal take on more urgency. Question number 5. What's standing in the way of your protagonist achieving their goal? Okay, this is the conflict part of the goal, motivation, stakes, and conflict chain. Conflict simply refers to the external and internal stuff that gets in the way of your protagonist achieving their goal. Look, in our real lives, we absolutely want things to go smoothly, and we want all of our goals to be easy to achieve. We hate it when things go wrong. But in fiction, well, that's a totally different story. After all, if it were easy for your protagonist to get what they want, what fun would it be watching them do it? In fact, there's nothing a reader hates worse than a scene where the protagonist succeeds too easily. It feels boring. It feels like a letdown. I know this sounds mean-spirited, but readers really want to see your protagonist struggle. They want to see everything go wrong. And then they want to see your protagonist scrambling to figure out how to deal with the mess they've found themselves in. Which means, as you start asking yourself this question, what is standing in the way of my protagonist achieving their goal? You need to make sure the answer is a lot. Whether you're talking about conflict at the story level or at the scene level, just remember that you always want the conflict to last. You don't want to resolve it too easily. There always needs to be some external bad guy in your protagonist's way. And if there's not an external bad guy in their way, there definitely needs to be an internal bad guy in their way, preventing them from achieving their goal. Better still, if there's both an external bad guy and an internal bad guy. Meaning, there are physical things that are standing between your protagonist and their goal, but there are also psychological things that are standing in the way. Maybe your protagonist doesn't think they have what it takes to be able to achieve the goal. Or maybe they're very hot-headed and they don't have the patience to do what it takes to achieve the goal. Maybe they just don't think they're really worthy of whatever the goal is. Okay, we have covered the goal, motivation, stakes, and conflict chain of narrative drive. Now, let's see these questions in action with a fun example. Since most people have either read The Hunger Games or at least seen the movie, I'll use this novel as my example. Question number 1. What is your protagonist's goal? In The Hunger Games by Suzanne Collins, Katniss's goal stays the same throughout the entire novel. She wants to protect her sister and her mother because she feels deeply responsible for them and she believes that they will die without her there to feed them. Everything she does in the novel comes back to this singular global goal. At the beginning of the novel, this global goal means that Katniss's immediate goal is hunting and trading to make sure they're fed. But once Prim is selected as the female tribute in the Hunger Games, Katniss's immediate goal shifts. Now, in order to protect her mother and sister, she has to volunteer to take her sister's place in the games. Question number 2. Why does your protagonist want their goal, and how badly do they want it? Okay, understanding the answer to these questions is where the reader really starts caring about Katniss, and, more importantly, starts caring about what she cares about. The reader learns that Katniss Everdeen's father died in a mining accident when she was 11 years old. After that, Katniss's mother fell into a deep depression and was unable to care for her daughters, forcing a frightened and grieving Katniss to step up and find some way to feed the family before they starved. This perceived abandonment is something that Katniss has never forgiven her mother for, and it hardened Katniss, causing her to become very distrustful of others and emotionally closed off. It's also the perfect backstory to explain to readers why Katniss would do something as crazy as volunteer in her sister's place in the Hunger Games. After all, Katniss has been taking care of her family her whole life, and she's not about to let her sister go off in the Hunger Games and get killed when she can do something to stop that from happening. Question number 3. Why must your protagonist achieve their goal right now? In a story like The Hunger Games, it's immediately clear why Katniss must pursue her goal now. The novel opens on the morning of the reaping, and by chapter 2, Katniss has already volunteered as tribute. After that, she's put on a train and taken to the capital where the games will begin in a few days. Katniss doesn't have the luxury of deciding whether or not she's going to pursue her goal. She knows she has to pursue her goal or die, meaning the ticking clock in this novel is the commencement of the Hunger Games. Question number 4. What's at stake if your protagonist doesn't achieve their goal? The stakes in the Hunger Games are objectively high. If Katniss doesn't win the game, she'll die. But there's an added layer to the stakes that makes them far deeper and more meaningful. If Katniss doesn't win the game, she won't be able to achieve her real goal, which is protecting her mom and her sister. Why? Because she won't be able to come home and continue caring for them. which means they will both die too. This more subtle layer of the stakes is where we learn to love Katniss. Question number 5. What's standing in the way of your protagonist achieving their goal? For Katniss, everything is standing in her way. The Hunger Games itself, and by extension the Capitol, the government, and all of the other kids who are her opponents in the games. After all, she's not a fighter, but she's being forced into a fight-to-the-death battle that she doesn't feel capable of winning. In order for Katniss to overcome these obstacles, she has to learn to fight. She has to learn survival skills. And, perhaps hardest of all for her, she needs to learn to make people from the Capitol like her so she can get life-saving provisions during the games. All this while trying to deal with the fact that she's in the games with Peeta Mellark, the boy who helped save her and Prim from starving so many years ago. And making things more confusing, he seems to want to help her, even though he should want to kill her. But there's something even more important standing in Katniss's way of achieving her goal: her own trust issues. That's right, her backstory is creating issues in her story present. Katniss doesn't trust her allies, and she's surly to everyone, making it very difficult for her to accept help when she needs it, and making it nearly impossible to win the love of the Capitol residents. Which means she's got a heck of a lot to overcome, both externally and internally, before she can win the Hunger Games. But that's exactly why this book is so wildly popular. It does an amazing job with the goal, motivation, stakes, and conflict chain that creates narrative drive. Okay, writers, I hope this episode was super helpful. Don't forget, if you haven't done so already, go click on the link in the show notes and sign up for that free workshop. It's going to be fantastic and you're going to learn so much. Also, please take a moment to follow this podcast and share it with a writer friend. It's a great way to show your support and let me know that you're interested in hearing more. Until next time, keep writing, keep dreaming, and remember, the world needs your stories right now. So don't you dare give up on your novel or yourself. Talk to you next time.